who immediately endorsed the idea of the region district. We got to know Supervisor Serna over the past year, so that his constructive effort to help resolve issues related to our contract and the overall budget situation. He'll be here in a few minutes to make some remarks. I'll finish the introduction later. So I want to walk through tonight's presentation, which is divided into 3 parts. Hopefully you picked up an agenda. First, we will hear about a topic that's on everyone's mind, the Sac City Unified Budget, and how it fits into both a state and national context. Second, we'll hear some ideas about what a world-class district would look like, including more class sizes, implementing arts and music, restorative practices, and vastly improved special education services, together with a robust intervention program. And thirdly, we'll hear from a few community and business leaders about the importance of making our district into a world-class school system. Let's get started. I want to provide a brief context for our first set of presentations, and I wanted to take just a minute to comment on the report of the state auditor that was issued on Tuesday. You may have heard of this. So I don't know about you, but kind of scratching my head about a number of things contained in the report, beginning with the idea of cutting wages of teachers when we're in the middle of a national teacher shortage. So let's leave that aside for a moment. To me, some of the most interesting parts of the report are found in the final pages of the report, where the state auditor responds directly to a number of assertions in the district statement about the report. I want to address 3 comments in particular. Number 1, I quote, "We did not validate the district's budget data." Also, the auditor says, "Our audit did not confirm that Sacramento Unified needs to make $27 million in cost reductions." And lastly, and this is a great introduction for our first speakers, I quote, "In reviewing its budget, we observed large variations in its budgeted and reported actual revenues and expenditures. In fact, Sacramento Unified has been unable to provide documentation of the rationale it used to develop many of the revenue and expenditure estimates in its 3-year projections." So, our first 2 speakers don't have any problem whatsoever providing the documentation of the rationale they're going to use to explain the current status of the district's budget. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mitch Olson, who is a leading researcher for the California Teachers Association, who has done budget analysis of hundreds of school districts throughout California, and was recognized within CTA as one of the most knowledgeable experts on school financing. And joining Mitch is Nikki Molesky, first Vice President of SCTA, who has lived with and analyzed Sac City budget in her role as SCTA officer and bargaining chairperson for nearly a decade.
I'm going to do my best to make sure I don't break the microphone. It's just barely hanging on here. So I was asked to come and do kind of a review of the Sac City budget. The first thing that I did is I looked into history. We have fantastic resources within the California Teachers Association. And I wanted to set the stage by letting you know that everything that the data that you're about to see comes directly from the Department of Education. Every school district in the state is required to submit what's called unaudited budgeted information at the end of a fiscal year. That gets sent first to the county office, and then it gets sent up to the Department of Ed. So anything that's old, anything that's in the previous years, that comes directly from the state. And then we did have to rely on the current information. We had to rely on what the district provided us. So with that as the pretext, let's go ahead and look at what we found. So the state of the Sacramento City School District budget, that was sort of the task I was given. I want to start by doing kind of a deep dive into history. Well, we'll start actually with a quote from the audit. In reviewing its budget, we observed large variances in its budgeted and reported actual revenues and expenditures. So what I have found, the auditor found as well. So this slide, let me explain it to you. Every single year when, in big numbers, what districts do is they have to put a budget or submit a budget by July 1 of the fiscal year. And they have to update throughout the year, and then at the end of the year, it's actually past the end of the year, it's September of the following year, they have to submit their final numbers. So what this graph is showing you is what Sac City said when it initially put its budget out at the beginning of the fiscal year versus what actually happened. So, the yellow is what they said was going to happen in their budget at the very beginning of the year.
Their general fund balance.
Their general fund balance. The blue is what actually happened. And I don't think it's hard to see the trend. In the beginning of the year, they claimed there was going to be a significant reduction in their ending balance, essentially their savings account. And what actually happened by the end of the year was much better than what they predicted. There are certain years where that was massive. Just so you know, we're talking tens of millions of dollars in this scale. And this goes back to 12-13. So this is a pattern that the district has established over a very long period of time. When you hear or when you see something in the SAC-B, typically what you're reading is the district's budget, the yellow. And what happens is it gets out into everybody's consciousness, and then at the end of the year, magically the problem that you read about in the paper doesn't necessarily get reported as not being the problem that it was described earlier in the year. And that is the trend that you see going back to 12-13.
I'm sure the 18-19 school year brought a lot of you here tonight, brought you more interested in what's going on in our school district and what the district is telling you about their budget. And here we're going to deep dive into what happened this past year.
So the past year, I'm sorry, I'm just going to move over. I have a big voice. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. This gives you the entire budgeting cycle from last year. The district is required, or all districts are required, to update their numbers throughout the school year. Last year, Sac City, because they were in fiscal distress, or at least they were claiming they were in fiscal distress, they actually had to do an additional report that most districts don't have to do. The green over here and the green over here are very important on the slide. This is what they ended the year with in reserves in the 17-18 year. It says $70.5 million. When they put their budget out, they were predicting that $70.5 million was going to go down to, help me out, $37 million. And that is what we call a deficit. They were predicting a deficit of $33.4 million. Then, when they had to update their numbers again, they were saying that that was going to go down to $42 million. That reserve fund was going to go down to $42 million. That's a $28 million deficit. Then it was going to go down to around $40 million, a $30 million deficit. And as you can see, as we get closer to the end of the year, what happens? The deficit disappears. So when they finalized their numbers to be submitted to be audited, their deficit, or their ending fund balance, actually only went down $171,000. Now that seems like a lot of money, but you got to understand this is a very large district and they play with very big numbers. Okay? I like to use the term budget dust. $178,000 is budget dust. It's not a lot to a big school district with lots and lots of resources. So they predicted dire consequences, but in the end, and so dire that they had the state legislature do an audit, right? I mean, they had everybody in Sacramento really upset, right? And then this is what ends up happening. So, from a $35 million projected deficit to essentially breaking even. How did that happen? Well, they did the tried and true strategy. School districts have revenue, so that's money coming in. You folks have revenue, you have a paycheck that goes into the account, right? And they have expenditures, money they pay out. You folks have expenditures, AT&T, your mortgage, right? So what they did throughout the process is they said the income, the money that was going to come in, was going to be much less than what actually happened throughout the year. And then let me get to the next slide, the next 3 slides, and then I'd love to answer your question. Then on the spending side, or on the expenditure side, it's actually, we call it, our nomenclature is outgo. It includes spending, but it also includes transfers out of the general fund into other funds that school districts have. Notice they sort of did the opposite. They said our expenditures are going to be really, really, really high, but they came in much lower. So when you put the two together, this is what you see. You see a $33.4 million deficit disappeared throughout the year.
And it was there in the winter time that the district became aware that they had not counted 5 schools and all that ADA, all that revenue for students. Now, many of us suspected that that wasn't a problem when we were trying to raise red flags, and the district knew that they had not counted those kids back in the winter. But we did not hear about that publicly until after they had held 4 budget forums upsetting everyone about this $35 million deficit and this budget crisis and being taken over by the state. And yet, come the end of the year, we're looking at only $171,000 in deficit spending last year.
I would add that I have looked at so many school district budgets in my career that I can't even tell you how many. What you see here has happened before. It's happened in other districts. What I think, though, is unique and that I have not seen in my career is this. I've never seen it done year after year after year, because typically what happens is districts get caught and they stop doing it. But for some reason, they haven't. I did have a question. Oh, are you okay?
Can you go back to that one? So the red bars is revenue?
The red bar is revenue, and the red bar is expenses, and the orange is revenue.
The orange is revenue? Or
The
is,
yellow.
because you were describing it as the difference
Well,
between the deficit.
maybe our colors are off.
Yes, so the orange is predicted revenue,
Predicted, that's right.
right? So predicted revenue throughout almost
Throughout
all
the year,
of
and you
it.
can see it's going up each time, right? Because they're under-reporting what the revenue is going to be. Okay? And they're over-reporting what the expenditures are going to be. And so the two converge at the end of the year, and you get $178,000.
It was different earlier, you were talking about the size of what the general fund balance would be. Then like the earlier slides, right? You were like, I think it was blue and yellow maybe.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's not the same as revenue and expenditures.
No, the fund balance is what's left over
What's left-
after
yeah,
all
right.
your years to
But
kind of.
we're not comparing the same thing over and over. Like the slides are all changed. Is that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
No. To be clear, we are not talking about revenue and expenditures. We're talking about, we are in this case, we're talking about revenue and expenditures. This back here was looking at ending balance, so you're correct.
But the last one was revenue and expenditures.
Right, and the way that those are converging so that the ending balance doesn't go down. So thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, they kind of look similar because they're 2 columns next to each other.
Sure, thank you for that.
And their predicted revenues and expenditures till the end of the year, where the last column is the unaudited actuals, which is as close as we can get to what was actually happened in 18.
And there are, just to be fair, there are sometimes changes that happen from the unaudited actuals. They're called unaudited actuals because school districts by law are required to have their books audited. And the audit that comes out in December, and when that comes out, there could be further revisions to the numbers, but typically it's not significant. There's not big changes that happen. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Yeah, you're describing this a little bit as if there's some kind of voodoo going on, like the bars are far apart and then the bars are close together.
As the year goes on.
Are you aware if the school district's Board of Education made any efforts throughout the fiscal year to close the gap so that by the end of the school year, we'd have expenditures coming in at a lower level due to policy changes?
I am not aware of that in the current year, but again, I'm skeptical of that claim because it appears that they do it every year. And so I think it would be bad fiscal practice to year after year after year to essentially budget a big deficit and then have it never happen. Why not just be transparent with the public and put forth a balanced budget instead of playing this game every year? So, but yeah, no, can I speak to last year or anything specific?
That comment makes it sound like the leadership over that whole period of time was the same, and it isn't.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And there was a big change in that last year's budget where there were significant cuts. If you
Right
were
here.
aware of that. Teachers.
I can't speak to that. I can just see what the pattern is over a long period of time.
And we've been carefully monitoring the district's cuts that they said that they made last year and the revenues that they misreported, and monitor that through their escape system and see what really is not spent and what appears to have been budgeted and not spent, and can speak to that in detail. We're going to go over one area.
Right, we're not, and we could do this, I could literally do this for every year, but I just did it for last year. So here's one area of the budget where clearly they were saying they were going to spend a lot more money than what they actually ended up spending. So it's under a budget category of 4,300, it's materials and supplies. Just so you know, does not include books or textbooks. So throughout the year, they were predicting that they were going to have spending. So just to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about here, what they ended up spending versus what they said they were going to spend, that was about a $13.7 million difference. The other thing you should know is that what they ended up spending was about what their average has been for the last 5 years. So there is a bit of a range. They spent, I think it was between about 9.5 million on the high end. I think 7.8 was the low end. But typically they're around $8.5 million. So they ended up spending on materials and supplies last year about $8.5 million. But throughout the year they were saying that they were going to spend a lot more. This, just so you know, this is a very, very common thing that I see in school districts across the state, where you have this budget of, saying that they're going to spend a lot on material and supplies. I always ask the teachers when I see this, when I see a 50% or 60% increase year over year in books or materials and supplies, I ask the teachers, are you flooded with paper? Are there lots of crayons? Have the principal's budgets just been totally enhanced? And I usually hear that has not happened. So in this particular year, this was one area where they clearly over budgeted. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mitch, thank you for the information. Real quick, and I'm going to say this, and I'm a union person. I'm not here, to be an enemy. I come in peace. But if this is something that you see constantly statewide to different districts, why doesn't the union have a clause in there and say if you don't spend the money, that we have to readdress as far as compensation or something like that? Put a clause in. I don't think the district is necessarily at fault for being conservative in their numbers. We can't fault them for that. So I think the union has to have a mechanism in place. If they don't spend the money, that compensation needs to be readdressed, or there's something else.
So I can't speak globally, but I can say that does happen. Okay, what you just described is a pretty, I don't want to call it common, but particularly in districts like this where there's a real lack of trust, yes, we call it contingencies in a collective bargaining agreement. So I don't want to because I haven't been involved in the collective bargaining process here. Right. I'm just doing a budget analysis, but I do want to say that is a possible thing to do.
Right. It's just the lack of trust. At the end of the day, the kids are paying the price.
Sure. Sure. I couldn't agree more. All right. So, yes.
Back to that last one. So that middle column you're saying was about $20 million, $21 million in budget, but they ended up at 8.5. They're averaging somewhere between $7 and $9 million.
Yep, and I think the average was 8.3 million was the 5-year average.
So sometime in the middle of the year, they decided it was gonna be $21 million, which they never spent.
Right. The best way that we can do analysis of school districts and sort of what's happening is we do trend analysis. So there are certain budget categories that grow over time, and it totally makes sense. For example, gas goes up. The price of gas goes up. Employee compensation goes up kind of on the natural. So there are certain things that grow, but there are other things that remain flat. Materials and supplies tend to remain flat. So anytime we see a massive spike, then that is a red flag. It's always a red flag, and I don't want to say it happens everywhere, but where there is sort of what I call budget padding, that is one of the most common places that the budgets get padded. Yes, ma'am.
So you can do any analysis of where they might have, say, canceled contracts to buy new materials or told schools to stop purchasing at, say, in May or April, so that that number didn't get spent because they knew they were in budget crisis. You didn't look at that,
I
right?
did not.
No, but you can tell when you look at the school site budgets and when you look at the district's budgets and you look at the trend of spending over time, they don't spend $21 million on our classrooms for supplies and paper and things for your kids to learn.
Well,
They
right, I
don't.
know, I'm on a school site council, I read our SIPSA, I know that we had $15,000 in our little school site that in 4,300 that didn't get spent because we budgeted it and the opportunity to spend it closed early and our principal was upset. So I happen to know that at least 15,000 of that is us. I can't imagine that other schools also weren't told to stop spending because we were in budget crisis.
Well, those were the amounts that were budgeted.
Well, okay, we'll continue. So the other common thing that happens is there's an underestimating of revenue. So here's just one example, again, from the district's budget. And this is a category known as other state revenue. Throughout the year, this is what they were predicting was going to happen. This is what happened. Just so you know, the difference between the top of that and the top of that is about $21 million. So just yet another example of numbers that didn't pan out over time.
So I'd like to
And
point
this
out
is,
that-
just so you know on this, the district has no control over this, right? Because this is money coming in. Yes, you could stop spending money like your example was, but in this case, this is just money they did not report throughout the year on the books.
Yes, and they can report it accurately. And as you see, we go all up to July with very little changes in it. And by the time the unaudited actual comes out, oh, there's $20 million more. That's concerning.
So some of these trends continue this year, in this year's budget. This is materials and supplies again. Again, the 5-year average is here, and then this is what they are saying this year they're planning on spending. And again, that's around $4.6 million difference. Last year, just so you know, they spent $8.5 million. So basically, if they spent $8.5 million, it would be somewhere down here instead of up here. And then this is all other state revenue. Again, they're saying there's going to be a year-to-year drop of $15.4 million. It's hard for me to say exactly what's in this because it's kind of a catch-all on revenue. But I will say that all of it is, except for a very, like $100,000, is restricted on the restricted side of the budget. And essentially, if it is in fact a big drop of restricted dollars, that should all be reflected on the expenditure side. So the idea is if you're not getting that money to do those things, because restricted dollars are, I give you $100, you must spend it this way on this kind of thing. There should be commiserate cuts in the budget because if you're not getting that money, then the things that was paying for should go away. So this is another, for me, red flag. I would not be surprised if this number comes in higher than what they're saying it's going to. We didn't go through every possibility here. We're just trying to give you the flavor of I'm trying to give you the flavor of what I saw. How does Sac City compare to other large urban districts? I was asked to look at, the percentage of money that goes to employee salaries and benefits in Sac City versus other big school districts. So in my research, I just looked at districts of over 30,000 students. You, Sac City, are green. You're basically right in the middle. There are many districts that spend a bigger percentage of their budget on salary and benefits than you do. There are some districts that spend less on salary and benefits than you do, but you're typical. Just so you know, we did highlight Elk Grove and San Juan, and as you can see, Elk Grove and San Juan have to spend quite a bit higher percentage of their budget on salaries and benefits than what Sac City does. That is probably in fairness because of the fact that they may not have as many, you get extra money for unduplicated pupils. Those are kids who are Title I, they're in foster care, or they're ELL learners. I don't know this off the top of my head, but my assumption is that Elk Grove probably has fewer of those students, and San Juan probably has fewer of those students than Sac City does. Just because they're more suburban, you're more urban. So Sacramento Unified has done little to control special education costs or seek additional revenue available for special education. This was in the audit report. Of everything I saw, this was actually the most alarming to me. Not that it's alarming in that we shouldn't spend money on special ed kids, we absolutely should. But this has been a significant pressure on the district's budget. So this is 14-15. This line is all relative to 14-15. I'll give you the headline. According to their 19-20 budget, they are saying they will be spending almost 85% more on special education than what they did in the 14-15 school year. That is real pressure. The way to see the way that certain kinds of spending is sort of impacting the school budget is to look at spending relative to the size of the budget. So, this shows you, as the percent of the budget, what is special ed, what has been their percentage of the overall budget. In the 14-15 year, they were around 10% of the budget. It is now projected to be in 19-20 almost 15%. So that's a real impact, right? That's growing costs that are starting to have a real impact on the budget.
And this has been a deep concern of educators in this district as well as many parents. Our district needs to do a much better job in providing special education services, but also kind of interventions that our students need before they experience the failure that leads for special education. And we have some experts who will be speaking later today about the kind of interventions and multi-tiered system of supports that we need to provide for our students so that they do not need to go all the way to special education to get the services and supports that they need. Not only is it the right thing to do for our kids, but it also is much more fiscally viable than what our district has been doing. We look forward to hearing from our specialists later today.
So the last thing I was asked to look at, I was told kind of coming in that the district had real concerns around healthcare costs and the impact of healthcare costs on their budget. Just again to review, this is a problem in terms of a budget, not the problem to spend on special ed kids, but in terms of a budget, you don't like to see lines going up like this, right? Well, that's not happening with healthcare costs. As a percentage of the budget, actually, healthcare costs are going down, not up. So this is
14-15?
14-15 was healthcare on certificated healthcare was about 10% of the budget, and it's now down to around 9% of the budget. And then the other thing I was told is that paying for healthcare for retirees is also an encroaching or growing expenditure for the district. And again, that's not true. I will make 2 points about this actually. Understand that all spending of the district, right? You're only talking about 3% of the budget for retiree healthcare. So there really isn't a way that I could see retiree healthcare ever really bankrupting the school district just because it's such a small portion of the budget. But again, the story on this is that as a percentage of the budget, it's going down, not up. Yes?
So that's percentage of the budget, not percentage of every year of the cost actually going up. Is that how?
Right, so here's the way we look at it.
Because
When you're talking about managing a budget, right? Bring it down to the home level. If you and your spouse get a raise, right? So you're getting 10% more, let's say, in salary. And cost goes up, then you can manage that, correct? Because there's an increase in your revenue, and then there's an increase in the cost. So you got to look at both sides of the ledger when you look at the impact of a budget. Now, let's assume this happened. Let's say that your healthcare costs, what the district made you pay in healthcare. Some districts, teachers have to pay for the healthcare. It went from $500, let's say, to $600. But you didn't get a raise. Well, that starts to have an impact on your budget, on your life, right? Now you're having to cut something because you have flat income, but a cost is going up. So what this is looking at is it's looking at both sides of the ledger. It's not looking at the escalating cost of healthcare. Healthcare has gone up for decades in this country. It's just looking at it relative to the growth of the budget and the growth of income that the district has. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
If you have one-time income coming in, will your revenues are skewed, so you can say, oh yeah, it's not going up relative to the budget, but that was only a couple of one-time monies that were coming in for a lot of the years over this time period.
There have been some one-time monies, that's true, but overwhelmingly the monies that have come into school districts have been ongoing. For example, the local control funding formula, I think you guys are, since 14-15, there's been about a 40% increase in your LCFF funding.
Right, and now it's flat because we're not going to get those big gains anymore.
We don't know that, but yes, it
Yes,
is.
we do, because it's fully funded now. Before, it was not fully funded, and they were increasing to get it to the full implementation. It's at full implementation now. At best, we're going to see COLA.
It is true that we are at home. There's other things in the budget that are actually moderated as well, which will be good for districts. For example, STRS increases are starting to are going to go flat. But I'm looking at, again, I'm just looking at the history, right? The history is that as healthcare has, over time, healthcare relative to income, the percentage of the budget that has to go to maintaining healthcare is going down, not up. Yes?
Mitch, so I'm the parent rep for the parents at Martin Luther King K-8 school. So what is the message that you want me to take back to them? Because I'm a little confused. You know, the district is telling me we're in danger of being receivership, and are you guys saying, no, wait a minute, we're not in danger of receivership? Like they're not being transparent with the number. What is it that you want me to tell my parents?
I am highly, I would say this. I would say that the district's budget is, I go back to this, the district's budget may be experiencing some difficulties, but it's probably being overstated.
So the 95 cents to the dollar. So for every dollar to the district, 95 cents goes to compensation and pension and stuff. Is that a false claim by the district?
If you look at the district's total budget, it's about 83.
Okay.
They're 83% of total output.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I guess from that slide, you were saying that's common, you say common throughout the state. So to see
Common what?
common
What's
that
common?
there's that much flow within the year?
No. This is
Common
pretty extreme, actually. I think what I would say is uncommon is this.
No, I meant the slide, the blue and yellow slide, where the budget flows throughout the year.
No, not to this degree.
No.
Well, no, I'm not saying,
Not to this
but
degree.
it flows.
It does flow throughout the year, but I've never seen a district where this was the trend for such a long time, and where the differences were so stark.
But I think she addressed
Year
that it
after
hasn't
year.
been the same people. so
There
it's
hasn't been the same people. I just know, as an outsider, that's the trend I see.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, and we have a big agenda. If you want to fill out this form, and we'll make sure we get back to you, but it's compelling information, so not a lot of people are interested. We just have a lot.
Yes, sir.
My question is, I get what you're saying about the budget, I don't get it, I'll tell you that right now. Over 90% of the cost of this district is employees, so you're not gonna tell me that health benefits doesn't fit into that somehow after being a state worker for over 30-something years. The other
Well, one thing the state auditor said was that they could not verify sort of the accuracy of what the district was saying. That was one of the quotes from the state auditor. I read that. I read kind of them saying something very similar to what I was saying. That the district's ability, we call it in our nomenclature, we call it position control. It's the ability of a school district on any given day to kind of know what they're spending versus what they budgeted. I felt like the auditor had that same concern. I want to be clear and say that we can only go based on the information the district provides us, and I am looking simply at a trend where what they say is going to happen is very, very different than what actually does happen. Did I consider the fact that there's a new school board? No. Did I consider the fact that maybe a CBO was fired? No. I'm just looking at that history. Then I'm also seeing some evidence in this year's budget of the same kinds of things that I question, right? It just doesn't make sense to me that you would have these big drops in revenue, for example, or these over budgeting in other categories. I hear you in saying that, some of you are saying that there's a new school board, a new sheriff in town. I'll just give you my honest assessment. I'm not seeing it when I look at trend analysis. And I don't know anybody. Right? I don't know any of these people. I'm just looking at numbers on a piece of paper.
Well, I think that's part of the problem. I think you guys need to be talking. You guys need to be talking. I mean, at the end of the day, these kids are suffering.
Right.
You know, we're underscoring, I'm being outperformed. And the unions, I love the union. You guys are digging in your heels. The district's digging in. Let's get some conversation.
Right, we're about to get to that part of the.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Part of the presentation, we have lots of conversation. First of all, thanks so much, Mitzi. I appreciate that. We're just rereading the quote from the audit before we move on. Page 63 of the audit, it did say, we did not validate the district's budget data. We identified significant variances between the district's budget and actual expenditure. So based on their projections, they made their recommendations. Anyway, to provide a broader view of how Sac City situation fits in around school funding and nationally, we are honored to be joined by Jonathan Katz from the California Budget and Policy Center. Jonathan is an expert on education policy with a focus on K-12 and higher education. Prior to joining the Budget Center, Jonathan taught law and United States history for 7 years in Martinez, California, where he also served as chair of Alhambra High School's Social Science Department. He holds a master's degree in education from the University of California, UC Santa Cruz, go Banana Slugs, and received his bachelor's degree in history from Yale University.
Oh, that was kind of fun. Yale. You only made it from Yale. Oh. David, nope, he's got it. Whew. There we go. Ooh. Great.
And pardon me, I'm recovering from a cold.
Oh,
usually I have a pretty booming voice. Can you guys hear me back there? Yeah. All the way in the back? You sure? Okay. All right, so thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation. As was stated, I am a senior policy analyst at the California Budget and Policy Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the California Budget and Policy Center, we are an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization in Sacramento. We analyze state budget issues with the goal of improving the lives of low and middle income Californians. We've been around since 1995. I came to the Budget Center in 2006, so I've been around for a little bit. I focus mostly on K-12 education, but I also focus on tax policy issues as well. And so I am going to be talking to you today about really how the state is engaged in these issues. I actually don't really pay tremendously close attention to what's happening at local levels, although I do have interest in what's happening here in Sacramento and in other areas. So I don't have expertise in what's going on in Sacramento, but I can provide you some important information about how the state and the state's role is crucial for not only what happens in Sacramento, but what happens in every school district across the state. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my goals here today My goals are to increase your understanding about how it is that K-12 schools get their dollars. I'm also intending to explain to you where those state dollars come from. I'm then going to explain why it is that state revenues matter so much for school districts. And I'm going to give you some ideas about ways in which state dollars, or actually dollars for schools, could be increased. So those are my goals today. So first, where is it that K-12 funding actually comes from? Not just in all school districts in the state. So what you're looking at here are averages across the state, but they're not terribly far different from what's happening in Sac City. So this is a pie chart that shows you how it is that a school district and County Office of Education together get their dollars in the state of California. The blue pie slices on the chart are the state sources of K-12 education dollars. Okay? So the largest pie slice, first of all of those together is roughly 60% of dollars that K-12 school districts and county offices receive on an annual basis. 47%, roughly half of those dollars come in the form of what's called state aid. About 10% of dollars that flow to school districts come in something that's called other state revenue. You heard that term before. It's dollars that are earmarked for specific purposes, right? Things like special education and child nutrition programs. They're earmarked, you cannot spend them for general purposes. And then the tiniest little blue pie slice on that chart is the state lottery. Roughly less than 2 cents on the dollar every year that the school district gets, okay? The rest of the money that comes to school districts comes from a few places. The largest one outside of the blue pie slices is from the local property tax, right? About 25% of dollars that school districts receive. And then less than 10% each come from two sources, the federal government and from something called other local revenue. Other local revenue includes things like parcel taxes, which I don't think you have here in Sac City. And then in addition, things like local education foundation contributions and the like. So that is how school districts get their money. You're looking at it. Now, a lot of attention is paid to the local control funding formula. There's a good reason for that. This chart is just going to be it's the same exact chart, but shows you where LCFF dollars come from. LCFF dollars come from two places. One, state aid, and two, from local property taxes, right? So the other thing to think about with LCFF dollars is that it's 3/4 of all the dollars that a school district gets. So that's one of the reasons everybody pays attention to the LCFF. It's a lot of what school districts receive, right? And when we look at the two sources, it's from state aid and from local property taxes. And when we look at that together, that is just LCFF dollars, 2/3 of all dollars that show up in terms of LCFF come from the state. So I just explained to you why it is that state funds are so important. One, it's the majority of funding that school districts get. Two, it's 2/3 of the money that comes for LCFF, right? So if the state funds are so important, which I would argue they are, where is it that they come from? Where is it that the state funding for K-12 school districts comes from? Well, it comes from something called the state's general fund. Really, practically all of it, 97% of it. So the state general fund, there's some small pots of dollars outside of the state's general fund, but basically it's coming from the state general fund. So what is the state's general fund? Well, the state's general fund is basically the state's checking account, right? It's the place where the dollars that the state has the greatest authority over how it is that it spends its money. And when we look at how the state divides up the state general fund on an annual basis, this is the pie chart that shows you that. Roughly 40%, were the largest share of dollars that goes out from the state general fund on an annual basis goes to K-12 education. Now, that means, and in most years, the size of the state's general fund, or the size of that pie chart, correlates with the amount of money that school districts get. So if the amount of general fund dollars, that is the size of this pie chart, grows in size, the state spends more on K-12 education. If the size of that pie shrinks, the amount of money that flows to K-12 education falls. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so that's why So what determines the size of the state's general fund? So now we've just said, one, state money makes a big difference for schools. Two, the size of the state general fund that's where it's coming from. So where do state general fund dollars actually come from? Well, first, annual state revenues matter a whole lot, and where they come from is three sources. So this is a pie chart that shows you the three sources that are the determinant of how much general fund revenue the state receives on an annual basis. The three sources are the personal income tax, the largest blue pie slice on the chart, 70% of all state funding in the general fund each year. Roughly 20% comes from the sales and use tax, when we buy things at the store, sales taxes, and then the third is the corporate income tax, roughly 10% of dollars that go into the state's general fund. So to review some key reasons why it is that state dollars matter for schools. First, the majority of funding that goes to a school district comes from the state. Second, the largest portion of the LCFF, 2/3 of the funding for LCFF, comes from the state as well, which both point to why it is that the state budget and the size of that pie chart is so crucial for how much K-12 school districts receive on an annual basis. Now, to give you some historical context here, rising state general funds over the last several years have meant an increase in funding for K-12 school districts across this state. I'm about to show you how it is that per pupil funding has looked over the last decade, right? So what we see in the middle here, if I can get my little, there we go, that's fancy. That's the low point on the chart, 2011-12. That was the depths of the end of the recession, right? And then, since that time, from 2012-13 moving forward, we've seen some significant increases in funding for K-12 school districts. You'll also note that one of the key ones is that first big bump that happened in 2012-13. That happened in large part due to the passage of Proposition 30 in November of 2012, which created a big increase to state general fund revenues. A large portion of that went to school districts. So what we've seen over the last several years is a leveling off of this general fund revenue and a leveling off of the amount of money that school districts have received. Now, at the same time that we see when there's increases in general fund revenues, there's increases in per pupil funding across the state. This is showing you what happened in the 1 year alone between 2007-8 and 2008-9 in terms of general fund revenues in the state. We saw a 1 year decline in that year of $20 billion, so roughly 20%. It was the Great Recession, right? And to go back to that same chart, if you look at what the result was for K-12 schools, there was a significant fall in per pupil funding in the state. $1,600 per pupil in 1 year alone, a roughly 16% reduction in how much money that school districts receive. So, I'm also going to talk to you a little bit here about some historical context, okay? So this chart shows you over a very long period of time, what we're looking at here is 1970-71, and here at the end is 2015-16. So roughly speaking, a 45-year period of time. What happened in terms of the three main sources for K-12 schools funding in the state of California? The blue line is the state's share of the amount of funding that school districts receive, and the yellow line is the amount that school districts receive from the local property tax. And what you can see in this chart is that there was a significant change that happened right around 1978, 79, and for those that might have been around then, or maybe not, and know a lot about tax issues in the state, what happened then?
Prop 13.
Prop 13, that's very good. So that's Prop 13. Prop 13 overnight reduced local property taxes by 50% from 1 year to the next. Now, what happened as a result of that? The state came in and, in essence, backfilled the reduction to funding for school districts. So the state became the primary determinant of how much money school districts received, and the local property tax no longer was the primary determinant. Now, also in that same period of time, this is showing how much California school districts receive on a per pupil basis relative to the nation as a whole. Right? So that zero line right there, that's the national average on a per pupil basis. And we are either above the national average or below. This is the same period, 1969-70 to 2015-16. And what you will see is that roughly speaking in about 1978, 79, and around that period, we're roughly speaking at about the national average in terms of a per pupil spending figure. And ever since Proposition 13, we've seen that the California per pupil funding has lagged the rest of the country since the early 1980s. Okay? So that's the historical context of how it is that schools have received dollars over this period of time. So I'm going to leave you with a couple ideas about how it is that funding for California school districts can be changed, or what it is if California school districts are so dependent on state dollars, then how is it that we can change that? Well, there's some good news. On the November 2020 ballot, or at least as is qualified for the November 2020 ballot, there is a thing called the Schools and Communities First Initiative. That initiative will raise funding from the local property tax in a particular way. It will change the rules such that commercial property will be assessed at its market value, as opposed to having a 1% cap on the annual increase in that value. And it'll mean overnight that the state, according to the legislative analyst, which is our state entity that helps us understand these things, that we're going to receive somewhere between $6.5 and $11.5 billion on an annual basis. 40% of that money goes where? Schools. So if you wanted to see an increase in funding at the state level for what happens for school districts, Schools and Communities First might be one way to look at it. I would suggest there's another place. It gets kind of technical. It's a little more in the weeds and sort of wonky. But there is something in California that we have we have tax breaks that go to a variety of different entities, whether it be individuals or corporations, but they're in our thing called the state's tax code. The wonky term is a tax expenditure. The reality is that we have a lot of tax expenditures on the book, and the way it works in California is to get a tax expenditure on the book, it only requires a 50% vote of the legislature. To get a tax expenditure off the books, it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature. So we have tax expenditures that are going on the books, and what a tax expenditure means is that for every dollar that does not come in, it's a tax break, that does not come into the state general fund. Do you remember back to my pie chart? How much does that go to the schools, right? 40%. So every dollar that doesn't show up in the general fund is 40 cents that does not go out to schools, right? So if you take a lot of money off the table by giving a lot of tax breaks, that's money not going to the schools. So one way to do it is to reevaluate tax expenditures. Is to say, all right, look, let's at least, when we pass a tax expenditure, let's have a sunset date. Let's say we don't actually have to vote on the legislative side get a 2/3 vote. Just say, 5 years, 10 years out, we're going to get rid of this thing unless we re-up. Or let's evaluate the tax expenditures that are out there and see if they're doing the job we wanted them to do. I mean, at least along those lines. So these are a couple ideas about how to bring state general fund revenues, up so that we would have more funding for schools. And with that, I'll leave it, and hope that was helpful. But I'm always happy to answer questions. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can jot down that, or just look up the Budget Center's website, and I'm happy to answer questions now and in the future.
I appreciate that. Was great information. Before I introduce Supervisor Serna, take this opportunity to plug Schools and Community First. In the corner, there are petitions. So if you have not signed a petition yet, please, before you leave today, sign the petition. You have to sign it by county, so make sure you pay attention, the county that you are registered to vote in. So as I started earlier to introduce Supervisor Serna, he was one of the first people we talked to this idea about having a community forum, and he immediately endorsed the idea and agreed to participate. We've gotten to know Supervisor Serna over the past year or so through his constructive effort to help resolve issues related to our contract and the overall budget situation. And for those that don't know him, Supervisor Serna is an extremely intelligent, hardworking, solutions-oriented public servant and the son of Joe and Isabel Serna, for whom the district's headquarters, the Serna Center, is named. I'm very pleased to introduce Supervisor Phil Serna.
Very brief, because I don't want to get really grouchy in front of everyone tonight. I just concluded almost 10 hours of public hearing at the California Air Resources Board, where I also serve as one of the members of that agency's governing body. As was mentioned, I wanted to waste no time when the invitation was made to participate in some fashion for this community gathering, this community forum. It looks like we probably have about maybe 80 to 90 folks here, which is a pretty good showing. And really, I want to kind of set the table in terms of my role and your expectation of my role very clearly. My allegiance is to a high-functioning school district, okay? It's not necessarily to the union, it's not to the administrators, it's not to just the teachers, it's not just to the parents, it's not just to the students. My responsibility is to my entire constituency. As you may remember, for some long-time Sacramento residents, it was my late father who, despite the fact that he was elected mayor, chose not to sit on the sidelines and kind of watch things happen in the context of our educational system here locally. And I feel very compelled in the same spirit to do likewise. We're all very well aware of the challenge that has plagued the school district for some time now. And I'm here standing before you not to try and spoon feed you a pre-made agenda by any means. What I would ask everyone very respectfully to do is certainly take in the great information that's being provided tonight, and let's approach this collectively with an open mind. I think we've had some time to kind of decompress, get out of our corners a little bit in terms of perhaps gravitating towards various allegiances that come with titles. But again, I would hope that everyone, including the union, would want to approach this very methodically in terms of how do we get out of this mess, find our fiscal footing. And to that end, I will tell you, I've had some very, I think, productive conversations with some folks recently about a way to do that. I've been asked several times, is there a way out of this? Is there a path forward generally? And I have to be an eternal optimist, District County Supervisor, and I think there is. And I think it's actually a pretty simple architecture to it. And that is, let's look at and explore very carefully and do it not unilaterally, just as the union or just as the administration or just as the elected leadership of the district. Let's look at it together in terms of what is feasible, reasonable to exhaust in terms of cost savings. And what I've been told time and time again by the leadership of SCTA is that once or if that gets exhausted, and I know there's kind of a laundry list of ideas that should be exhausted in public in a very transparent setting with parents involved, if at the end of that there's mutual conclusion that the only thing left to do is either simply just look at healthcare contribution and cost savings, then I think what I've been told, again by the leadership of the union, is that there's a reasonableness there to sit down and have an honest conversation about that. I don't think what you're hearing from anyone is no necessarily right now. But I think, unfortunately, that's kind of how things have progressed over the last year, is that and that's why we've been at kind of loggerheads. So, again, I'm not willing to be a spectator on this. You'll recall back in this spring, I penned a joint Sacramento Bee op-ed with Mayor Steinberg explaining that, because I think it's our responsibility as other local electeds to flank the elected leadership at the district, but certainly have a respect and be willing to work with our labor partners and understand again the fact that our constituents are the same constituents. They are the same students. They are the same parents and families. They are the same teachers. Okay, also my constituents. So again, that's what I think tonight really represents, is the beginning of that conversation. I want to thank SCTA for coming up with the idea. It wasn't my idea. I simply was willing to put my name to an invitation. I'm glad to see that the turnout is what it is, and I wish you well in the balance of the evening. I will not be joining you for the balance of the evening. I recently had back surgery. So I'm going to go home, get off my feet, and wish you well. But again, as I continue to recover, I would hope that we can kind of jointly build some momentum around problem solving together. So with that, thank you.
portion of our forum here. As Supervisor Serna pointed out, we need to look at how to move forward with resources that, as many of you know here in the room, that we actually found in our contract with potentially changing health plan and using those resources for the students, right? It's not news to anyone that in 2017 we reached an agreement with the district that addresses those issues directly, that would reduce the cost to the district, but at the same time, without adding a penny to the budget, it would use those resources to go towards badly needed services to students. Okay? No secret that we're in the middle of a major dispute with the district after the district backtracked on that agreement. However, we are pleased to announce that we have finally have an arbitrator selected and expect that hearing to be held in February. So that's moving forward.
Yeah. Finally.
Thank you. Our first group was going to discuss the importance of school climate and other supports to improve conditions for learning. We'll be hearing from Carl Pinkston, who is the coordinator for the Black Parallel School Board. Carl has served, has served on the district LCAP committee and has led the Restorative Practices Consortium and chairs the Community Priorities Coalition. Carl. After Carl, I'm going to call your name and come on up here. We're going to hear from Nia Moore-Weathers. Is Nia here? Yes. Thanks, Nia. Community organizer with You Forward and a 2012 graduate from West Campus, Go Warriors, who continues to live in the district. Let me see, is Mike Beverly here? I don't see Mike Beverly from SEIU was going to speak. He's not currently here. And our last speaker is Nurse Na, Dr. Na Lee Hines, a school nurse at Luther Burbank High School and several other schools. Na has been a school nurse in Sac City, I think, since around 1998, right? Something like that. Received her PhD from UOP. And so, thank you all for You can either use a microphone or just stand up and use a big voice. Carl, you want to start us off?
I have to use
Use the microphone.
I don't use the microphone.
Use the podium?
Yeah, I have to use the phone.
I take that down really well.
Good evening, thank you. It's always an honor and a privilege to be able to speak about an issue and a concern that is of great passion to the Black Parallel School Board, but also to the African American community in general. And that is the issue as it relates to the question of school climate. I also was told I only got 5 minutes. I'm honored that 5 minutes. So I'm going to speak a little bit about it, and then also what some of the proposal of what we have done to move this issue forward. One is that in 2011 and 12, for the entire state back in those days, there was 709,000 suspensions across the state. There were more students suspended than students that were graduating in 2011 and 12. Today it's down to about 300,000, and that is partly due to the fact that groups like Black Parallel School Board, ACLU, Public Council, a whole host of groups across the state came together and said, we need to do something different, and working with people like Dan Losa and Tia Martinez, and across the state and said, listen, students cannot learn if they're not in their seat.
Right.
If they're not seated and not in front in that chair, there's no possible way can you teach that student. So in Sac City Unified School District, there was about 4,944 suspensions that year. And of those 4,000 suspensions, about 1,000, and it disproportionately reflected African American students. In fact, it was 42.2% of the suspension back in those days were reflective of basically black and brown students. And of that, approximately 40% was due for what we call willful defiance. Just because a child came in with his hat turned backward or bopping and weaving, they were suspended what was called 48900K, willful defiance. A number of us began to work together with him, Sacramento, and a number of different issues, different groups, 500 council centers to come together in the Sac City and say, hey, we needed to do something different. Because at that time, the Sac City Unified School District policy, as it relates to school climate, simply said you need to be suspended and expelled. That was it. There was nothing positive in that school discipline policy. And we were not the only one. This was across the state. But we knew if we were going to set an example, we needed to step up and do something different. So part of what we did was bringing folks together, and we decided to pull together folks together, do some research, do some analysis, do some study, and begin to change the district policy as it relates to school suspension and expulsion. One of the things that I want to let people know is that in 2014, we was able to do that. But all of a sudden, everybody forgot what that policy was. So I'm going to read it to you. One of the board policy 5137 says, the board will ensure an ongoing professional development training aligned with the school and the district reform goal to all school district staff and any individual that has a partnership that involves interacting and working with our schools, staff, students, and community. More specifically, professional development and training will focus on evidence-based school discipline, conflict resolution, cultural relevancy and responsiveness, and behavior management, social justice and equity. This before the new superintendent came on board. We were talking about equity. Okay? That was in that particular policy, in that policy, 5144, 37. 5144 speaks more specifically because a lot of people don't realize exactly what was in it. It specifically states, which the district has not implemented. And it wasn't because the teachers union said they didn't want it. In fact, this was the teachers union words. So let's get this story straight. It basically says the superintendent designee will provide to the board an annual plan that will address the rollout of professional development, ensuring that all districts will be trained in the following. Mandatory professional development in the area of school-wide positive behavior intervention support. Underscore, mandatory. Professional development in restorative practice, social emotional learning. Mandatory. Professional development in the area of implicit bias. Mandatory. Professional development in the area of cultural proficiency. And again, it has not happened.
Nope.
In a way that it should have happened.
Nope. We wanted it.
So part of it, since that time, we've been working with the teachers union through my participation in the contract negotiation, because we felt that the teachers union should lead on this question around cultural competency, implicit bias, and the rest. Not follow, but lead. All too often, the assumption is that the teachers union respond, but do not lead. So going forward, what we have to do, we have to continue to push, because to this very day, too many black and brown students are being suspended and expelled for all kinds of reasons. And they're not getting the highest quality of education mandated by law. So we need to continue to do implicit bias training, PBIS training. We need to push forward to make that as part, not only as a hashtag, but as a real value program that we push to make really happen, to show that if LA Unified School District, which have far more students of color, can drive their suspension numbers down to 3%, why can't we do the same? Thank you.
Hello, folks. I just want to say thank you, Carl. I feel the same way. Also, thank you, David and John, for providing me the space to speak on this panel tonight.
My name is Nia Moorweathers. I'm a community organizer with Youth Board. Youth Board is a local nonprofit that works at the local and state level through advocacy and active policy change to better systems impacted youth and the environments where they live. And as a former youth of Sacramento, the education of my peers is extremely important to me. I'm a graduate of West Campus in 2012, and I did have a positive experience there. I received over 32 credits that nearly accounted for a full semester of my college by taking AP courses at that school. I had the opportunity to participate in drama clubs, so I did shows with my peers, and I also struggled along in the Hiram Johnson pool as a part of the West Campus swim team. So I really got the opportunity to have a fairly full school experience, but the one thing that I didn't receive was information about who I was. And as a young woman of color, that left me at a loss as to my own identity and my history. And as an adult, now returning back to Sacramento and being provided the opportunity to work in schools directly with high school students, I see that same pattern occurring. I see students who have, all of this time to participate in after-school activities, but aren't really receiving the education that they truly need to prepare them for that outside world. And when I say this, I work in a program called Blunt Talk. I work at McCarty High School, and I also work out at George Washington Carver, Rancho Cordova. And this program that I run is trying to combat the lack of culturally competent and historically accurate curriculum that we need at our school campuses, right? So Blunt Talk, this program I run, it covers the war on drugs. We talk about redlining and gentrification. We talk about the structures of our city budgets and active movements that are occurring in American social rights, on top of all of the other issues that I know impact our students here in Sacramento. Blunt Talk has been extremely successful, not only due to my dedication to the students and the oversight and guidance that I receive from the teachers who I work with, but because Blunt Talk covers information that impacts these students in real time. And the students not only engage with this material, but they're hungry for this material. I can't tell you how many emails I receive from my students outside of the classroom asking me questions about these local issues that we hear about, talking about our president, President Trump, his impeachment, our civil rights issues that we're dealing with today, police brutality, climate. So I believe, with all of that being said, that it's the duty of the district and the administration and our teachers to create structures that respect our students' past and futures. I think it's also all of our responsibilities to support movements like Measure G or the California Department of Education creating an ethnic studies graduation requirement. This is something that if I had had the opportunity when I was in school, I really would have appreciated being able to take advantage of. These types of initiatives create spaces that encourage our students to become future leaders, and they secure resources that we so desperately need for our schools, our teachers, and our greater communities. In closing, I would urge that we stay consistent in this commitment that we have made to restructuring this environment that our students exist in, and to support a complete education for our Sacramento youth. We always say that it takes a village, and the village should be represented. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Nurse Na. It gets confusing. David did say I have my doctorate in education. I've been with the school district for 21 years. I was actually raised in this district. I came to America in 5th grade, and Parkway Elementary School was my first school. And I went, went to Fern-Bacon for my middle school years, and so I love this district so much. When I got the chance to come back to be the nurse at Fern-Bacon, I happily took it, and have just really loved working in this district. I got a chance to come back and be the nurse at Parkway also, and that was really cool. Currently, I know on the program it says I have Luther Burbank as one of my schools. That's actually my extra our district, last year was about, each nurse would take care of about 3,700 students. This year is about 4,000 students. The national recommendation is one nurse for every 750 students. California's average is about 2,200 students per every school nurse. We rank pretty much to the bottom, but not quite at the bottom. But Sac City Unified actually ranks just like above 2 other states in terms of our equal nurse ratio. So Utah has a ratio of 1 nurse every 4,200 students, and Michigan has 1 nurse to every 4,800 students. So we aren't doing really well by our students. I know, I don't think people know that number because we serve every school, so we run around to schools and do all the things that we need to do. But what it really means for our student is the things that nurses used to do, right? Now we train teachers, we train the office manager, we train the clerks to do, right? And we train sometimes the principals to do if nobody else wants to do it, okay? And our students are increasingly more medically fragile. We have students with uncontrollable seizures. We have probably 75 students who have diabetes that requires basic care, for insulin, for carb counting. What if, their blood sugar drops? What if their blood sugar goes up? So, and asthma. Obviously, we have asthma at every single school in very large numbers. So that's what I do. I do trainings on how to give shots, how to give life-saving medications like glucagon, like EpiPens, like Diastat. And then I recently have added on with all the mass shooting, I now train teachers and staff on how to stop the bleed, which is a program to teach people how to stop life-threatening bleeds in case of mass shootings. So that's kind of what it's come down to, and it's just so strange to me because the kids come to the teachers if they have a headache or they go if they have a severe allergic reaction, then the office manager may be the person who's giving them their EpiPen, right? But we don't go to our accountant when we have a broken leg, right? I mean, teachers didn't go to school to be nurses. They went to school to be teachers. And so it's sort of this sad thing that's evolved over the 21 years I've been with the district. So when John asked me to come and speak, I said, well, what do you want me to say? I mean, what do you want me to speak about? He said, well, why don't you tell them what it would look like if we had more nurses? And I said, okay, and I was kind of pondering it, and then this week hit, and I had a really rough week. I drove, the first 3 days, I drove about 200 miles total because I had a new student who has diabetes, and I had to set up all his care, and in a perfect world, I would have been the one to take care of him, but I had to train people to take care of him after I built this relationship with his mom and him, and promising her that he's going to be well taken care of at school. And then yesterday, I drove to a school to do a special education assessment. So I was just supposed to do vision and hearing, and then I'll call the parents to ask about their general health. And this young woman comes in, and within just a minute or two, chit-chatting, I'd never met her before, and I said, oh, how are you, and et cetera. And she said, oh, fine. She said, well, in a few more months, I'm going to be going on maternity leave. She's a 10th grader. And I said, oh, okay, well, when are you due, and just all of that. And she just looked at me and she said, I'm really scared. They're going to cut me. I think I have to have a cesarean section, and I'm going to have twins. And so, I kind of talked to her a little bit about what a cesarean was like because I knew that was her biggest fear, except I just wanted to say, oh, that's the least of your concerns if you're going to have twins. But, I didn't want to scare her too much. And, checking in on her, but when John talked about in a perfect world, what would that look like? It would look like that I would go back and make sure that she's getting prenatal care, that she's taking her prenatal vitamins, that we go do a home visit and make sure she has all the things that she needs for those 2 precious babies to come home and be successful. And that my little guy who is the new diabetic, who is so scared of poking his finger 4 or 5 times a day and having to give shots in his stomach, that I would be the person who teaches him how to do those things, and I would be the person who goes through this journey with him and make sure that his mom gets all the texts with all his numbers and making sure he's okay. But I'm not, because it's not a perfect world, and I'm covering 19 schools. Well, Burbank is 20. So we do the best that we can, but we're not providing the best care for our kids. And Mr. Serna said, he's here for everybody and the constituents and this and that. I will tell you, bottom line, every time I'm here for the kids. It will be always about the kids for me, what's best for the kids, how the kids are cared for on a daily basis. Not just adequate care, but the best care because they deserve it. Because I got that when I was here. So that's in my perfect world that I hope we get more nurses so that the office manager is not the person who's providing care, but an actual nurse. Thank you so much.
Super compelling. Next session, we'll drive more directly into the classroom. We're going to hear from 3 great Sac City teachers. Melissa Reynoso, 6th grade teacher from Hubert Bancroft. Aaron Duarte, 6th grade also from Tony Express. And Hillary Calvert, drama teacher at CKM McClatchy. And they'll be speaking on lower class sizes, assessments, and enrichment.
Hi, good evening. My name is Melissa Reynoso, and I am a proud Sacramento City school teacher. I was asked here tonight to share my experience about class sizes. I have been teaching for 26 years, and in those 26 years, class size for grades 4 to 6 have always been 33. The cap has always been 33 students. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the experiences that I've had in the last 2 years. Last year, my class was over 33 before we started school. I started without enough textbooks for kids. I started without enough desks for kids. I started and I taught for a good 3 solid weeks with kids who I knew weren't going to be in my class at the end of the month. And those kids had to go find another place to find a school. And that was really hard on them. It was hard on their teachers that they're going to get, because those teachers started the year without a full class or without as many kids in a class. This year, I have 30 kids, and I consider that to be a lucky class size. And I'm not joking. I feel like I've got room to breathe with 30 kids. And I have one child in my class who came from another school 3 weeks in. So he had to basically start over, learning my rules, learning the ways of school, after he'd already started the school year. This is a pattern that has been happening over and over again, year after year. It is my strong opinion that 33 kids in elementary school is way too many. And I can just give you a few little examples because I was thinking about it. Our computer cart at school has 33 computers in it, laptops that we use, and we have to use them for a lot of reasons. Now, the cart itself physically was only built for 30 kids and 30 computers. We have rigged it to put computers up on the tops of it to kind of make it, work for 33 kids and 33 computers. And I really find that that happens a lot. When I go to buy scissors or rulers or class sets of novels, most of the time it's 25 per class set or 30 per class set. I go on Amazon and I want pencils or something, and it's almost always a number I know I'm going to have to order double up because our classes are so high. Now let me continue on with that computer story. When you have a laptop of computers and 33 kids and 33 computers, I bet you know what's going to happen to at least 1 or 2 of those computers per day. They're not going to work. And what are you going to do when you had 34 kids and you don't have 34 computers? We figure it out. As teachers, we figure it out. And the same thing goes when, and I can tell you now, my lucky 30 that I have, I'm so grateful there's 3 surplus computers because more than likely something is going to go wrong with the other ones. and I'm grateful to have it. And I'm grateful for 30. And I know that it doesn't seem like a lot when I say that there's a difference between teaching 30 kids and teaching 33. There's a lot of difference. There's a difference in the stacks of papers that I take home. There's a difference in the amount of time that I can give each child. There's a difference between how I can logistically organize my classroom where I'm not tripping over backpacks and lunch boxes and finding enough hooks on the walls to put things. There is a huge difference in these bodies and in the way that they feel and in my mood, in my spirit, and in the way I can talk with parents about I know the children better when I have fewer of them and I can identify them and I don't get them as confused as I often do. There are so many reasons why we have to continually think about class sizes and why that matters. And when we talk about budgets and when we talk about the issues that we're having, I urge you, please, do not forget that our efforts for class size and a reasonable class size is incredibly important. Thank you all for coming tonight.
So Melissa's first day of school story kind of reminded me 2 years ago. I'm 6th grade also, so 33 is the norm. And I started with 41 students on the first day of school. And most of you know that first day buzz. So when the kids come in, it's almost like Christmas morning, right?
Yeah.
So we have all the supplies for them, pencil boxes, crayons. And those are things that we purchase for them. So knowing that I was going to have 41 students, I had to go out and make sure that I bought those extra supplies. My parents are going out at the Office Depot sales that'll have the 1 cent, the $1 things. I make my kids go with me, and I have to give them the money because you can't all be together. They have to be separate. So all those little things that you kind of don't think about that teachers are providing, and it is a huge difference to provide it for 41, even if they're only going to be there for a short time. But they're there on that first day, and it's their first day of school, whether they're going to be there the next day or the next week or not. So we want to make sure that whenever we have them, we're creating the best experience for them, and nobody's feeling like they don't belong. It also reminded me of conferences. We've been having conferences this week at school. So I did a little math. I'm not a numbers person, and please, it's nothing like anything you've seen. It's just my one little experience. We get 90 minutes during a conference week. So we get 6 days of conferences. That comes out to 540 minutes or 9 hours taken out of the normal 6-hour school day. So instead of a 30-hour school day, 30-hour week, we're getting 9 hours over those 6 days to use for parent conferences. So I have 33 kids, and if everybody came in on time and they overlapped coming and going, I would have 16 minutes and 36 seconds for each child to go over everything I need to discuss as a 6th grader, their standards, what they're meeting, what their needs are, then going to middle school, 16 minutes and 36 seconds. Spring is different. We only get 5 days. So I need to math for that, but it's shorter. I'm averaging about 30 minutes per child, so I'm using, in addition to the time that the district allows us, an additional 7.5 hours during conference time. So what that means, I have my own family too, so I'm calling on my parents to go and pick my kids up. There's dinners at my parents' house a lot because I'm trying to get all the kids in. And that's time that we talk about communicating with parents, and that is so vital. It's more important than anything else we can do that face-to-face, so we can sit with them. For the 6th graders especially if they haven't had a child that's gone to middle school, they have so many questions. The kids are nervous, the parents are nervous, so a lot of that time is telling them about open enrollment. How do you go on? How do you pick a school that's right for your child? So these are things that they're not getting anywhere else. They're counting on us to be able to give them that information. It doesn't include the grading. So if you get your child's report card, I think there are 83 individual boxes on that report card, so 83 times 33, and the time to just grade all of the students' work, evaluating their individual needs. So that brings me to testing. I worked with the district and with the union on the MOU about testing. And I was really disappointed because a misconception came out about this MOU. Standardized testing is different than educational diagnostic testing. So as a teacher, ideally, every child would go through diagnostic testing to get that early intervention in. That would be the best way for every child to be identified. If they don't need it, then they move on. But there's so many kids that I'm getting identified in 6th grade. That's unacceptable. No child should be identified in 6th grade with something that could have been identified earlier, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. So the testing that we're talking about is not that diagnostic testing. It is more along the lines of the curriculum embedded assessments. So if you know a teacher, you might have heard at the beginning of the year, a lot of time was used to give the oral reading records. 1st grade, kindergarten, I think it was something like they would have needed 9 hours in order to test all of the children that they needed. For me, 6th grade, it was about 2 hours of time individually, and that means I'm working with one student and I have a group of, the rest of the classroom is off on their own. That first week of school, I need to build my relationships with the kids. I need to have them interacting together, having them work independently. I haven't even built that into my classroom management yet, so that's time that is not being given where it needs to be. Teacher-created assessments are used every second of every day. So we're constantly monitoring everything from the first time they walk into that classroom. I'm looking at how they write their name. Did they capitalize it? A lot of 6th graders aren't capitalizing their name. Can they write a complete sentence? And then I have tests that I'm going to do like at the end of a math chapter, or if we're reading a novel, I'm going to give them some assessments. That's letting me kind of reflect on their progress, but also on my own. Is what I'm doing working for that individual student times 33. The curriculum embedded assessments are not usable. They're not meaningful to me. A lot of the material is good for some students and not for others. I have a wide range of students. With some of these tests, it's really unfair to expect them to sit with this material that I know they're not at that level yet. We're working to get them there, and it's so disheartening to expect a student to sit there for sometimes an hour or more. So for math tests, I was told by my administrator, about 45 minutes for this. It was like a benchmark unit test that the district wanted. We had a range of 20 minutes, which was really fine because that kid shouldn't have been taking that test. As his teacher, I knew that. He wasn't quite at that level. He's receiving extra support to build his foundational skills. So 20 minutes to 5 hours because that kid wanted to do his best. He wanted to make sure every step was followed. I'm not going to tell him not to do that. But that means I'm trying to manage what are the other kids doing and figuring out how to get him back into the fold when he's done with that. I didn't use that data because I had given my chapter test. I knew where every kid was. I could tell them exactly what the results would have been. We get beautiful graphics that pull up all the data for us. I knew every single kid where they were anyway. I did have a few kids that scored better than they should have because they guessed well or they got lucky. So that data isn't usable to me because it's not really telling me what they know. I need my students to work their math problems out. So when they're on the computer, they kind of scroll. They read a little bit differently. If it's a word problem, I see your hand, hold on. Please don't hand pass me. I'm just a teacher, like I'm so for them, for my kids, I really need to see that work. I need to see their thinking. A multiple choice, I can't do that. So when they take the test, even though I'm giving them paper and saying, make sure you work everything out, it's still a button they're pushing on the computer. And there isn't the same time investment as when I give them a paper pencil test. So the big thing also with this is there's only so much time, right, in a day. And all the time that's given to assessments means something has to get cut. So testing, language arts and math are tested. That's precious time. It's not going to be cut because they want the scores to be at a certain level and it's going to be measured by those specific tests. So social studies and science are going to be on the chopping blocks. Science is tested in certain grades, so some of that is not going to be cut as much in those grades. So the thing that is always going to be cut is going to be anything arts related. So music, dance, actual, art, it's all that's going to be an extra activity that some schools will have because they have a PTA that can bring in $80,000 and they're going to get that extra enrichment at the end of the day or built into their program, or they're going to have field trips. But if you're at a school that doesn't have a PTA at all, because there's not someone that can do it, then those kids are not getting those, what's called enrichment, but really should be core. At,
Like, the PTA money is one thing, having it or not. But like,
So the
whether you
time-
have the time or not isn't related to whether you have the money.
I'm
Those
not.
are two separate issues. Having the PTA with money that can pay for field trips is a separate issue of how much time and assessment.
Okay, I don't think you're understanding though that there is a certain amount of time that has to be taken for the test. Something's gonna be cut where, so
Whether
basically.
you have a PTA that can raise $80,000, then you.
Okay, let me get back to you. I know you're very, hot about tonight, so I'm gonna move on to my spiel. I'm not like here to debate you. I was invited just to speak about my experience. My concern is the kids that need to come to school every day, who need a reason to come to school every day, aren't getting art, aren't getting music. How do we get those kids to come? How do we give them a reason to wake up in the morning? It's not going to be a language arts activity. It's not going to be math. How do we get them to have an activity that speaks to the human spirit, that speaks to their experience, that lets them express themselves and learn about others' experience and empathy? That's going to be through art, music, dance. We don't have that for our kids. So that's testing. Yes, there's tests that need to happen. Do we need the district embedded tests? Find a teacher that uses them. If they use them to guide their instruction, they should be using them. If you're not using them to guide your instruction, it's a waste of the student's time. So I'm going, I think, a good segue over to our arts person. But I'm just, as a parent, my kids never got art or music until they went to middle and high school. I could pay for that outside, but why should we have to pay for something that our school should be offering? Why should we pay for something when there is money if we use it the way it's supposed to be used and we prioritize? Art and music and ways to get those kids to school every day, that's how we're going to do that, and it's not going to be through more testing.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hillary Calvert. Your agenda says I'm a drama teacher at McCarty, which I am, but I've really been the teacher at Hiram Johnson for the past 12 years. And I was the drama teacher there. And while there, I experienced the fact that, you know, no matter what successes I had with that program, whether we won awards or I was fully enrolled or we put on 1 play or 3 plays a year, I still got the same responses from administrators like, hey, when I would say, hey, I know you need electives, how about a full-time drama situation? It's fun, it's engaging, and you know, something that matters to schools is that kids show up and can earn credit, and dramas, and you know, if you show up and you play, you'll earn credit for drama, right? So I'm thinking to myself, year after year, this is a no-brainer. Let's do this, right? And year after year, I got the answer like, well, if you work a little harder next year and you recruit and you do, you know, every year there was an A, B, and C that was a little different. And for the first few years, I did A, B, and C, and I got the same result every year. Like, well, you know, the way money works, right? There was always something about staffing and money that prevented that art program from being able to grow, even though it was college prep and everything else. So I applied when the district put out a call for lead art teachers in the district. So they asked for teachers all throughout the district to apply. Like, here's a chance to plan and change the way we do things. And I thought, oh, good, thank goodness, an opportunity to make change at a different level. And we had our first meeting, and we all got together, and they said, okay, guys, how are we going to pay for arts in the district? And I thought, like, who are we going to reach out to? What committee are we going to form? Who do we know with money? And I just thought, this was a giant mistake, right? Like, the thing that I was hoping to do, which is work on the district level with, you know, what are the core values that we have? What do we want to be teaching at the elementary school level that can build to elementary so that by the time they get to high school, you know, instead of me working on memorizing lines, like, we're starting with Shakespeare. Like, wouldn't it be beautiful? And And since I moved to McClatchy with an arts academy, I'm finding that the funding formula is the same. And what I'm there as the drama teacher, and I'm hearing the same thing. If you recruit, right, and these types of things, and you know, a lot of us, it's hard sometimes to hear that teachers want more money, because we often just think that we're doing our jobs and bringing our, but the truth is, the district asks us to do so much more. And they know that we care so deeply about the kids, just like all of you guys do. And as teachers, you know, they ask us for a lot. And the problem that's happened over the past few years is we've been giving and giving and giving, and not just for my pocketbook, you guys, because I didn't, you know, I'm never gonna be rich. Like, it's the thing they promised me for my program, for my kids, and that's the things that aren't coming through. And those are the things that are not, they're affecting teacher morale, and then it's affecting our kids. And in obvious ways, in ways that we're not seeing, because they're not getting the education they deserve, the depth of education they deserve. Most of our enrichment programs are funded not from the district. These after-school programs that are being publicized by our schools are being funded through an outside source. And the field trips are being funded through parents, right? So if your school doesn't have an organization, a strong group, your kids aren't getting it, it's not fair. And we have to fix the financial situation so we can fix these opportunities for our kids.
Melissa, so great to hear them speaking from their heart. Yes.
So the second teacher who spoke said, I'm just a teacher.
Just a teacher.
So teachers are very important people in this community.
Thank you, Jim.
A lot of people in this community think they're very important, and they're nowhere near as important as our teachers.
Thank you, Jim. Just real quick, and I'm a little behind, but I just want to say, so I've known Jim Kitty a long time, and he came to CB Wire 20-some years ago. Said the same thing. He said when we started the home visit project to go out and meet families based on the organizational model 101, Jim said, you're going to find that really you're a hero. You might hear all this other stuff, all this noise. You might read it in the Sacramento Bee. You might hear people who have high ability to put out things on, at that time it wasn't social media, but when you go out, you're going to be a hero. You're absolutely right, Jim. So I appreciate that, and I feel that same way today about all our teachers and educators. So let's segue finally. We felt it was important both from this student and budget perspective to spend a little more time discussing special education. As Mitch and Nikki showed, one of our biggest cost drivers and the major outlier in the district's budget has been its spending on special education. Currently, nearly 16% of Sac City students are identified as special needs. That's approximately 5% points higher than the statewide average. So to provide more insight, we're going to hear from Nafisa Young, school psychologist. She has worked in the district since 2013. And Andy Powers was a parent of a kindergarten student at John Cabrillo, and he's previously worked several years as a teacher in Southern California. While she's putting that up there, there are a few copies, by the way, of MTSS Special Education PowerPoint that is kind of a best practices from CTA at the back. And if you want your own copy, if there's not enough back there, then let us know or fill out that form.
Okay, so good evening. My name is Nafisa Young, and I am a school psychologist. I'm at Leah Tata Floyd and John Still. So as a school psychologist, I've been assigned to more schools in the district than I can count. In my role, I have seen it all. And one thing that stands out to me more than anything is the lack of uniformity when it comes to services and supports for our students in our schools. One example would be that I've only worked at one school that's had a credentialed reading intervention teacher. And we all know all of our schools could use a credentialed reading intervention teacher. I've also only worked at 2 schools that had an intervention teacher for our ELL students that actually spoke the language, the home language of the students that they were serving. There's also a huge misconception that students who come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds don't need supports and services. However, I know from being the school psychologist at Crocker Riverside, Floyd, Cal Middle School, Gideon, I know that my students from all walks of life, they all need services and supports. Now, they might not all need the same types of services and supports in the same intensity, but they all need supports. And it's unacceptable for some of our schools to have absolutely nothing. Well, actually, there is something, because when there aren't supports in our schools to support our students with their educational, social-emotional, and behavioral needs, there's one game in town in Sac City, and that is special education. When I talk about schools that have a lot of supports, I don't want to leave out the fact that Leah Tata Floyd has just about everything you can imagine: a full-time social worker, a full-time nurse. I'm there 3 days a week. There's a community support center on campus. None of that was financed by the district, as was stated before. That was brought to our district due to the admin at that school creating community relationships that were so important to get those services there. When students lack academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports, again, at Sac City, the only game in town is special education. If a student needs services and they don't qualify due to predetermined constructs, we must examine whether or not our structures are effectively designed to foster student success. Right now in Sac City, we need to examine our structures, and one way we can do that is by adopting an MTSS structure district-wide. And so, MTSS stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports. And Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports, or MTSS, is defined as an integrated, comprehensive framework that focuses on core instruction, differentiated learning, student-centered learning, individualized student needs, and alignment of systems necessary for all students' academic, behavioral, and social success. Many of you have probably heard about RTI, Response to Intervention, or PBIS, which is Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. Well, MTSS is a framework that brings together both RTI 2 and PBIS and aligns their supports and helps serve students as a whole. So response to intervention looks at academics, PBIS looks at social and emotional learning, and MTSS is a combination of them both. There's many elements to multi-tier systems of support, such as multiple tiers of instruction, intervention, and support. There's a problem-solving process, data evaluation, communication, and collaboration. And that's really involves a special education teacher and a general education teacher. Leah Tata Floyd, we have co-taught classes, and so you're actually able to see that work in practice. A capacity building infrastructure, so with professional development, coaching, written plans, and leadership, meaning that leadership takes an active role on campus and district-wide. While MTSS is not a special education initiative, it supports, again, all students, including students with disabilities. Therefore, special education staff should play an integral role in the design and development of those systems of support. There are also a number of common structures and practices that can be leveraged to support MTSS framework, and those structures and practices, when implemented well, allow for special education, service delivery, and ensure that all students are included in high-quality Tier 1 instruction. So there's different examples of structures that support students with and without disabilities in the classroom. One is inclusion. So that is when a student with disabilities are placed in the same general education settings with their non-disabled peers with appropriate accommodations and supports to allow for success to the curriculum. In inclusive settings, general and special educators work closely together to create instructional plans that are rigorous and purposeful and meet the needs of all students. And the goal is to collaborate, to design, develop, and deliver instruction and supports matched to student needs, which may or may not include assessing for special education services. There's also inclusive practices, which refers to the instructional and behavioral strategies that improve academic and social and emotional outcomes for all students with and without disabilities in the general education setting. And the last one I'll talk about is co-teaching, which is an evidence-based model that exemplifies the key tenets of MTSS. It leverages the power of collaboration to best serve students. In many effective co-taught classrooms, it's hard for an outside observer to recognize who in the room is a special educator and who is a general educator. In the co-taught classroom, students with or without disabilities are able to receive the same type of intervention support as a student who does have a disability. And in fact, I know that McCarty's a co-taught school, so I know when I was at Cal, when I had students who were struggling and they were going to McClatchy, I would always encourage those parents, look, make sure your kid's in one of those co-taught classes. Same with my students at Leah Tata Floyd. If they're suffering in math and ELA, let's get you into those co-taught classes at Cal, so that way you can get that intervention, that intense intervention support.
Can I ask a basic question? I'm really glad this is on the agenda tonight, because I've heard a lot about MTSS, and I hear a lot of parents are interested in it. Do we have it implemented at all in Saxon Unified? Okay.
No.
So I think I'm hearing from SCTA that you're interested in implementing it school-wide?
District-wide, yes.
District-wide.
Or district-wide?
Yes, yes.
And we have written proposals to that effect.
So,
And this is part of it.
okay,
Yes.
so this is like, but I mean, this is tied to contract negotiations?
Yeah, so I'm gonna get into that,
Oh,
actually, a little bit.
Okay.
And then I'll jump back into that too. So I was gonna say, when MTSS is done with fidelity, studies have shown reduced special education referrals, which would also impact our budget in a positive way. It improves school climate, it improves academics, and it decreases behavioral referrals, just to name a few of the benefits. And in conclusion, we should not wait for students to fail before they get support, and parents should not have to fight for a special education label for their students to get the academic, behavioral, and social emotional support needed to be successful. During our last contract negotiations, the bargaining team expressed the importance of increasing support staff, including psychologists, nurses, counselors, behavior intervention specialists, social workers, and etc., in order to support our students and their needs. So I encourage parents and community leaders to stand with us and demand that our district adopt MTSS so we can all support our students. You guys should not have to write a letter and demand for your kid to just get the basic accommodations that they should get in a class, or get the basic amount of help that they need. We should be giving that to them. I should be the last step, not the first.
I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, yeah.
But here's my question, and I'll turn to David.
Oh, I'm on the board of directors too, and on the bargaining team.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's something that we talked about.
So when are you guys talking about it? Because I thought April 6th was the last time y'all tried to, I mean, or initially, because
So-
what are the steps that need to happen for MTSS?
So there's a few things, not only with MTSS, but also with dyslexia. So SCTA has actually, they got a group of, well, when we first did MTSS, or was it dyslexia? We had RSP teachers, speech and language pathologists, psychologists, district HR people, everyone high up meet. We meet twice, we come up with all these ideas, nothing for a year. We don't hear anything. So we meet like once or twice, and then we come back with all these questions. There's a bunch of other things going on that are more important than taking care of this. The budget has come up a lot as a reason why MTSS costs money.
Oh, MTSS.
Well, because you need additional support staff in order to implement MTSS with fidelity.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
So,
Another
one
question.
question.
I don't see MTSS as a bargaining issue. I see it more as something that kids should have.
Right.
And that, that the district should collectively develop together, including teachers.
Right.
But not really so much as the teachers' union dictating kind of how that works.
So-
Making proposals. It seems like it should be the stakeholders of the district together, everybody.
So the
But I feel like
SCTA
teachers
doesn't,
I feel like teachers have been left out of the whole SCTA is the teachers. Been involved. Have teachers been involved in the work that's being done?
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I wanted to make this very clear that we drive SCTA.
Teachers
So we do. The bargaining unit, the people who work for the district, we tell them what we want to address. So because I'm a psychologist and I was on the bargaining team, my big issue was the fact that why does one psychologist have 5 elementary schools? How effective are you going to be when you're writing 150, 175 reports and you're only scheduled at a school maybe every other Wednesday morning? So one of the proposals was, we need more psychologists. District offered us 2, took our 2 away. So same thing with the nurses, the counselors, the BIS. We said we want more of them. Now, more staff equals more support for programs like MTSS, RTI, us being able to provide services to the students without having to give them a label, just giving them what every kid should get.
Yeah, so I know we're getting late, but I do feel compelled just to remind people. So how does the bargaining come in? Well, we reached an agreement that was signed by the district to get these things, and unlike other unions who try to get the same things, but, and I'm not disparaging other unions, they say go find the money. We found the resources, which again was this health plan savings, which the district agreed to do to move to less expensive health plan. All of the savings go to what we've been negotiated, but not a penny more. We did it in a budget neutral way. That's how you do it. The district hasn't just implemented on their own. So as Nafisa said, our members, the ones on the front lines, are the ones that come up with our priorities and basically tell us what to do. The district agreed to it. That's what we're going to arbitration on. So that's how we do that. And so that is, you have a question first?
Yeah, I just want to say this real quick. Yeah, like when we bargain, the only stuff that gets bargained about is the stuff that we bring up. Nothing is fed to us. Everything I brought up was.
I think it's important to note that kids need more than just teachers. We can't do everything. They need support. They need psychological services. They need nurses for medical services, reading intervention, and there's just things that there isn't time to happen in the classroom. So we ask for these supports, and that's why SCTA asks for us.
Thank you for that. So very passionate. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Andrew Powers. I'm going to keep this short because wife's at work and Sitter's on the clock. Just let me get it straight. I'm not pro-union. I'm not pro-district. I'm pro-Tadashi. That's my son. He's 5 years old, and he's a kindergartner at Rios Elementary School. He's had a chance to experience the good things about the special education department and the bad things about the special education department. There's a lot of good things and a few bad. Unfortunately, the bad parts cost a lot of money. He was diagnosed with autism earlier this year. His journey through special education, our family's journey through special education, started last December. Fortunately, he was expedited through the assessment process. He got his IEP, we got the services. He was enrolled at Washington Elementary School downtown. Had a fantastic pre-K teacher. Had speech, had OT services a few times a week. Fortunately, our families was also able to provide those services outside of class time. Recently, he just got behavioral therapy, so there's been a huge learning curve for our family trying to navigate this entire system. And as it was pointed out earlier, my education background, my background is in education. I taught for 11 years in Los Angeles, middle school math, and this is all new to me. So he had his end of the year IEP in April of this year. And we we were made aware of a speech and language class, a kindergarten class at K1 at Cabrillo, and my wife and I had a chance to go observe it and fell in love with it within the first 5 minutes. We determined, as with his teachers and as a team, that would be the place we formed for kindergarten. We were told by the district that was not going to be possible, the class was full, and that he would have to go to Tahoe Elementary School. Nothing against Tahoe Elementary School. It's further away from our house. We looked at the class and we didn't like it as much as John Cabrillo. So the district promptly enrolled my son at Tahoe Elementary School. And we didn't find out about this until June. And promptly after that, we sought the services of a lawyer and began due process with the district. Due process is not cheap, and it happens on both ends. We have a lawyer, the district has a lawyer, and due process begins, and it's a fight, and we're fighting for our son's placement, and the district is fighting to get their way and to save money. Bottom line. So, first day of school rolls around, and our lawyer advises us, don't go to Tahoe, stand your ground, and we will work this out. It's easier said than done for him, not for my son and my wife, who's seeing first day of school signs of everybody else on social media, and my son's at home with dad. I'm going to try not to get emotional about it, but yeah. So, fortunately, 2 weeks later, we got a call that a spot had opened up at John Cabrillo, and he was promptly put in. Yay, fantastic, great. 2 weeks go by where my son wasn't in school. We've been in litigation up to this point, and we were still supposed to have a hearing this month. 2 months, a month after my son started school at John Cabrillo, which we are absolutely just amazed with the progress he's made up to this point. 1 month after that, we settled with the district, and it's not cheap. And part of the settlement, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but part of the settlement was coverage of court costs and lawyers. And it's not cheap. And I'm talking in thousands of dollars. And when it's our lawyer in the thousands of dollars, I'm sure their lawyer is in the thousands of dollars. And that's just our family. I mean, imagine how many of these needless lawsuits are in the works right now. I mean, what, 10, 50, 100? And then I hear figures I hear budget figures of special education funding being 50% more than it was the year before. Well, how much of that is in litigation fees?
A lot.
How much? And for what? For nothing. You mean to tell me my son couldn't have gotten into John Cabrillo? One space couldn't have been made in that class for John Cabrillo on the first day of school? And we had to lawyer up to get this? Okay, the bottom line is, I shouldn't have to get a lawyer to get the resources, get the class placement, get what my child needs to succeed. I shouldn't have to get a lawyer for that, especially if it's in writing the year before from their own staff. I shouldn't have to get that. So, you want to look at areas in the budget that can be made up and close the gap. To me, that's a red flag. Bottom line. And it's, again, I'm not pro-union, I'm not pro-district. and we've experienced some of the great things that are available within the special education department. But the needless litigation is something that needs to stop. And, you know, if you folks are parents of special education students or know some of them, like, this is something that needs to be brought to the district's attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy and Lisa. Appreciate it. Speaking from the heart. So we're on to our last and briefest portion of the program that we would consider sort of the moral and ethical charge to us all from business, labor, and community leaders on the importance of all working together to make Sac City a world-class public school system. We had scheduled Barry Broom, the CEO of the Greater Sacramento Economic Council, to speak. He regrets he's unable to attend. We'll put his statement online as we will our PowerPoints. Now I'd like to call up Pastor Les Simmons. All right. South Sacramento Christian Center. Les is a former board member of Sacramento Act.
I'm sorry to interrupt a moment, but I just was so touched by his story of his son and the dealings that he has to go through. Unfortunately for me, I have a different circumstance. My son was arrested a day before his birthday. He has an IEP. He has a language impairment. Last year, he was just diagnosed with autism. He has ID with no behavior plan. He was not given a manifestation hearing, and he is now sitting in juvenile hall with a 211. The school was aware of this. They did not contact me, and so now tomorrow I have to sit here and think about all the stories that I've heard, and wonder how mine is going to turn out. And I just want to thank everyone for their time. And my son actually, I've been in the pocket area. I've been there for 10 years. I just got my associates, my MA, and so it's really unfortunate. And he goes and his name is John F. Kennedy, and no one has any answers for me. No one can tell me anything. They're talking about holding my son until he's 19, and he was turned. I had to take him off a high school diploma track because they kept modifying the curriculum for him, and so he was far below basic average. He's never written a book report. He's never done a paper. He was not expected to succeed. The district did not want to offer him services. I tried to give him a one-on-one aid, which was denied time and time again. I just don't know what else to say. So thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you for sharing. It's heartbreaking stories. Appreciate sharing. So Pastor Les Simmons, pastor in South Sacramento Christian Center. He's a former board member for Sacramento Act, which is a multiracial, multi-faith organization advocating for the transformation of Sacramento based on shared values of justice and equity. He currently serves on the board for the Mac Road Partnership.
So I won't stand behind there because I might use it for other reasons. But this young lady, I would love to see you right after this. I do have some folks that possibly can connect with your son on a day program that we run. And how many teachers are still left over tonight? How many parents of kids? How many leader organizations that are here as well too? Yeah. I'd like you just to give all of yourselves a hand clap. Let's do a big one. I know it's getting late. You being here this late definitely just shows the passion you have for our children, the passion you have for the path forward, and I believe it's what's going to ultimately bring the change that's necessary. I'm coming from currently, before getting here, Folsom State Prison, where I was asked to go in and be a part of a conversation about redemptive value with the Sacramento Kings. And the kid sitting next to me was not a kid, but he's been in there for 20 years. Oh. And this is what he said: I've had to educate myself in here. And if I had the education out there at the time I needed it, I wouldn't be in here. And that kid grew up the same neighborhood I grew up in, same community I grew up in.
And the difference between me and him is that I had a teacher to advocate for me. At my early age, I was put in special education. And it was a teacher that came and said, you don't belong here. Let me help you out of here.
Yeah.
Not that this isn't a place for that's needed, but not for you. And she began to work with me and my parents and began to advocate. And next thing you know, I was put back in the proper space I was supposed to be in. Also, another teacher that was very instrumental in my path was in the 9th grade. This particular teacher helped steer me and a young group of kids in the right direction, and now that teacher is one of the superintendents for a school district himself. You play a vital role in the change that's necessary to move the district in the right direction. As a leader, and I'm here today, I'm on a run for also an elected official position, city council. I believe our youth have to be prioritized. I believe after-school programs have to be prioritized. Mentorship programs have to be prioritized. A few years ago, we cultivated a group and helped purchase the old Cal Skate building over in South Sacramento. Anybody remember Cal Skate? There are a lot of folks in here. We said because we have to re-envision the future for our community and for the young folks in the community. And since then, we have revitalized it, and now we serve over 1,000 kids a month in our programs that go through that facility. I believe the path forward is in the room. The passion that you have, the articulation of the change that's needed that you have is definitely what's going to drive the district to a better place. I look forward to working with leaders, with the parents, with teachers, and most of all with students to continually create a better tomorrow. My time is short, but I'd like to thank you guys for giving me a platform. We talked about this some time ago, and I jumped on board right away and said I definitely want to be involved and definitely want to lean in to help move us forward. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you.
Next, we want to hear from Jeff Freitas, president of the California Federation of Teachers, which represents 110,000 educators. Jeff here, yep. Across California, Jeff is a former math teacher from Carpinteria.
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 Thank you. Thank you so much. And Carpinteria. As I said, I'm from the California Federation of Teachers. It's the other teachers union. But in this fight, there's no them and us. We're in this together. As you've heard, there is a long history of underfunding in our education system. And that's something that we can do about, fight about. And as you've heard, in other school districts, there's so few nurses, there's so few counselors, there's so few programs to try to fix the system that we're trying to fix, to try to eliminate that school-to-prison pipeline. We are trying to work on that, but the problem is, like here, the administration's making these decisions without the stakeholders. They're making these decisions without the teachers. And that's why, when we have to, we take it to the negotiations. When we try to get these MTSS programs and these other programs impacted and involved, that's why we have to demand it at the negotiations table. Because they're not doing it with us, we have to do it and force them. Because we are here to help our communities. That's why I got into teaching, and that's why a lot of the teachers in this room got into teaching, and everyone, to help our students and to help our communities. So what can you do? There are things that were mentioned earlier. Schools and Communities First is going to be on the ballot in November 2020. We have to pass that. We have to change what the funding system. We have to make sure the corporations are increasing our funding so we can create those programs that we need, those professional developments that were talked about earlier. IDEA, special ed funding. Federal government has mandates, and they're only funding 20% of those mandates. That is abysmal, and that's approaching on our budgets, and that's been shown. IDEA is going to be voted on next week. The House is trying to increase dramatically. Presidential candidates are talking about dramatically increasing IDEA money. We have to call them on that and make sure that they are doing that. Title I funding, which helps our schools, are also on the line. We have to make sure we increase that. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot that we need to do in this community. You could all move the needle and work on these things. And I want to thank you for inviting me tonight, and thank you for the fight that you're doing in this community.
Finally, por fin, we have Luis Cespedes, a founder of the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association. Luis was the 2018 Sacramento Distinguished Attorney of the Year and was instrumental in drafting Sac City's Safe Haven Resolution and the City of Sacramento's Sanctuary City Ordinance. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I too will try to be brief. I just want to thank you all for being here. And I would particularly like to thank the leadership, not only of the National Education Association, but the Sacramento City Teachers Association for moving very quickly on a very important issue that confronts our community daily, and that is how we respond to the immigration enforcement activities of this administration. Right. And I'm pleased to announce that in conjunction with the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association, the Family Unity Legal and Education Program that the city financed with a $300,000 initial grant and a $100,000 private grant, that we are moving forward on what this district promised on December 6, 2016, to implement a safe haven policy and provide educators and administrators and parents and teachers with the tools they need to respond to this immigration crisis. In the United States Supreme Court, there are clerks now going back and forth from each justice, deciding who's going to vote on whether or not the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival or DREAMER program remains. Those of us who watch this closely believe that the program will likely be deemed no longer valid for various statutory and constitutional reasons. And that means, according to the Attorney General, Javier Becerra, my dear friend and a graduate of McClatchy High School, a product of this school district, that 750,000 children in California who have one undocumented parent and 250,000 children who are themselves undocumented are going to be in crisis, in crisis mode. So we have already begun a pilot program of training. We put that training out. I see some of the faces here that are familiar. You've been to at least the 2 or 3 initial trainings. We're going to begin to do some more at Burbank High School and actually do what the district promised, which is bring some of these tools home. Why? Because we want to make sure that people have a safe, secure, and peaceful school environment. Remember Thomas Jefferson. He said that democracy will fail if we do not have an enlightened electorate. And I was shocked to learn that 1/3 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. Think about that for a moment. As the House now debates articles of impeachment, 1/3 of Americans cannot name the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. It is really, that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we need a world-class educational system, because demographics is destiny. 40% of our children are Latino, 17% are Asian, 14% African American, and many of them are immigrants from the Dominican Republic, Virgin Islands, Jamaica, etc. So the world has come to us, and now we must have a world-class school district. And we have to fight together. We have to work together where we can with management on our training and with teachers and with labor. But if we don't rise up and respond to our destiny, then our democracy is going to fail. And we are at a crossroads. And that's why I'm so happy to be here. I'm so honored to be with teachers who really do make our future. You make our future. Without public education, I would not have become a lawyer, and certainly not a distinguished attorney. I had a public school teacher that told my father in 5th grade, your son will go to college. That's the first time I ever heard those words. So I am a product of a school system that invested in children. And I'm so happy that you've invested your time and your hearts and your labor and your dollars to make this world a better place. And our immigrant families, they contribute billions of dollars to our economy.
Yep.
They pay taxes through their rent and what they purchase, and they are the critical employees. As I told the city council, there is no farm to fork without a farm worker.
That's right.
We will not eat if we don't have farm workers at our table. So again, thank you for having this forum. I really am honored to work with the leadership here, the National Education Association, and all the lawyers who are going to be investing their time and effort in this program. Thank you all, and have a very nice holiday, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Si se puede, right?
Si se puede.
Listen, yes, we went long, but we weren't going to cut anyone short. There was so much passion, and you guys can feel it. We could have gone on a whole forum on every subject. Thank you for coming. Take some extra cookies. If any teachers can spare 5 more minutes of their lives, our super volunteer, Robert. First of all, Robert, where are you? Thank you, Robert, for doing this. We could use some help picking up the chairs or whatnot for teachers that are super volunteers. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays. Thanks, Anand, for doing